Picture an Australian novel about a young woman in inner-city Melbourne in the early 80s, navigating a burgeoning intellectual and cultural life, an expanding sense of the world from her studies, but also an explosion of friends and lovers, of sexual jealousy and anxious navigation of social and personal boundaries. It's a slender book, and many critics seem to be bogged down in questions of form and content, asking how much of it is fiction and how much is just based on the author's own life. I suspect if you were setting up a drinking game for Read This, one of the more dangerous prompts for drinking would be mentions of Helen Garner, our first guest, the patron saint of this show, and also part of the inspiration behind our annual pilgrimage to Fitzroy Pool. So it would be natural for the above description to immediately prompt the eager listener to hit their imaginary game show buzzer and shout, "Monkey Grip! It's Monkey Grip!" But the novel in question isn't that classic debut. It's almost more than 50 years old now. The novel I'm talking about today is a new release, one that came out late last year by one of Australia's most accomplished and admired literary novelists. Despite making a name for herself with sweeping maximalist novels, Michelle de Kretser is an author who has never been afraid of formal experimentation. Her seventh book, Theory and Practice, supports this idea. It's bold, and once again, there's a heady mix of serious intellectual inquiry with beautifully observed characterisation and then formal play. It's a novel, but the front cover carries a photo of a young de Kretser, presumably at the age of the book's protagonist. A writer who is ostensibly narrating the book. A handful of pages in, after the opening of what reads like a naturalistic historical novel, the narrator chips in. At that point, she writes, "The novel I was writing stalled." It's really hard not to read this interjection as de Kretser's own, the confessional, inquiring voice as belonging unfiltered to its author. This blurring between fiction and memoir, between narrative and essay, is the prevailing mode of the book, and the product is thrilling. I'm Michael Williams, and this is Read This, a show about the practice we love and the theory behind it. I love this novel, and its sense of intellectual curiosity and structural playfulness only enhance the human story at its heart. But that cheekiness about category, about how it should be read, those aren't incidental pleasures. They're front and centre of how the book's been published. And the obvious starting point is its front cover, the striking design by Text Publishing's designer Chong Weng Ho, and the book's author looking out at us as we begin. I thought I might begin by asking when you knew you were going to be comfortable with, or you wanted, your own photo on the cover of this novel.
Okay, well, Chong asked me for photos of the 1980s. I sent him a small selection, because I don't have many photos, full stop. He came back with that one and said, "How would you feel if I made this famous?" I said, frightened. He said, "Why?" I said, "Well, I don't want this novel to be taken for a memoir." And he said, "No, we'll take care of that. Don't worry." While he was working on the layout, I was, of course, still frightened of that misreading. And I was talking it over with my partner, who made the very salient point, as he often does, that whenever a woman writes a novel with a first-person narrator, it's taken as autobiographical. So he said, you could put a photo of anything on the cover, and it would still be read as autobiography. And I certainly had this experience with my last novel, one half of which had a young female narrator. So I thought that was a good point. And when the cover came back, well, of course, under the photo were the words, "The new novel," underlined twice. And I looked at it, I thought it gestured at the hybrid nature of the novel. It was saying this is not straight fiction, but it's not memoir either. And the more I looked at it, it all fell into place for me when I looked at the photo, and it reminded me of Magritte's famous photorealist painting of a pipe captioned, "This is not a pipe." In other words, reality and its representation in art are not the same thing. I don't know whether that was what Chong was channeling, but I do know that certainly towards the end of the novel, a character specifically warns against mistaking realism for reality. So perhaps that also played its part in Chong's decision. And I am really pleased we went with that cover, because I think it's very striking visually. And I think it has meant that a lot of young women in particular have picked up the novel. And that is, of course, extremely gratifying.
You mentioned several times about the reading that it invites. And it seems to me that it invites a particular reading, but perhaps more than that, and not just the cover, but moving into some of the choices made within the book itself, it provokes a particular reading more than it invites it. That there is a sense of challenge and play here that is designed not just to passively let the reader come to it on their own terms, but actively to unsettle, or to just to force them to do a little bit more work.
Yes, absolutely. I quite like unsettling readers. Why not? I like novels that unsettle me, my expectations, that play with my expectations. And so, yes, absolutely. I think that's fair to say that it does, let's say, strongly encourage a certain reading, which is then not necessarily followed through. We don't want to have any spoilers, but...
No, I love it, and there is a palpable sense, and I have felt this across your entire body of work. Your appetite for play and your desire not to allow the constraints of convention to hold you back seems to be more acute with each book. Is that a reasonable summation?
Yeah, thank you. I'm flattered by that, of course. But I would say that, for instance, my second novel, The Hamilton Case, very much plays with the expectations set up by the conventional whodunit. So I guess
That's
it
true.
goes back a fair way. That kind of interest in form and narrative convention, certainly with this one. And as you say, I've had this interest in destabilizing the realist novel. And so I wanted to write what I have come to call the hyper-realist novel, the novel that doesn't read like a novel. And hence the start of Theory and Practice, which presents a completely conventional realist novel, and, if I might say so without sounding boastful or anything, I think quite efficiently, for, given the length it is, sets up an intrigue, a plot, a miscarriage of justice, a possible romantic entanglement. In quite a few pages it does that efficiently. And then it changes completely. And the reason for doing that is, it's like placing black and white. Both colors come up sharper when they are placed next to their antithesis. So I wanted what followed to seem, as the narrator says she wishes, to be telling the truth, to seem utterly and completely truthful and not like a novel. And one of the other reasons or sort of secondary reason, I suppose, for having that realist extract at the start is that, the narrator is a novelist. And when you get to the end of the novel, you see how little events and little details that have happened to her in her life are reconfigured in the fiction that precedes, that starts theory and practice. So it's kind of like the theory and practice of the novel as well. I had in mind that instruction you get in maths exams to show your workings. So if you like, the whole of the hyperrealist novel is kind of the workings, showing how those little bits make it into fiction in disguised form, transformed, made fictional, often out of recognition. So that was of interest to me as well, how to demonstrate how little facts from one's life get turned into fiction.
When I finished reading, I went out and got myself a copy of Virginia Woolf's The Years, which I have to confess I had never read. I mean, Woolf obviously is very important to this book and to you as a writer, but could you talk for a moment about The Years in particular and what it is that piqued your interest about that particular book?
So in the novel, the narrator is writing a thesis on Virginia Woolf's late fiction and on the three last novels, namely The Waves, The Years, and Between the Acts. I'd actually read both The Waves and Between the Acts, and I hadn't read The Years. It was Woolf's bestseller in her day, and it's really underread now. So I read it because I wanted the late fiction because everyone writes about the Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse. I wanted something different. And I read it, and I read about it in Woolf's diaries, her composition of it. I was quite surprised when I read it because it's a very conventional novel, largely realist, really, and coming after the extreme modernist experiment that was The Waves, it was strikingly different. And I understand a writer's wish to do something different, but this seemed almost like a return to Woolf's first two pre-modernist novels. So what I found out about her original plan for the novel was that she wanted to do something very distinctive and different. She wanted to write a novel made up of alternating chapters of fiction and non-fiction. So a novel about an English family that would cover about 50 years, and in between those fictive chapters, she would have an essay commenting on the social changes that had taken place in Britain at that time. She wrote an awful lot. She wrote about 100,000 words and then discarded it, which is sort of heartbreaking thing for a writer to have done. But she discarded the plan, I should say. She used fiction to write the novel that became The Years, and she used some of the essayistic material for her book, 3 Guineas. So I liked that idea. I thought that was a really fabulous idea, actually, the sort of mix of fiction and non-fiction. But I also felt that the reason Woolf abandoned it, and I don't know why she abandoned it, but I felt the reason must have been that it's terribly schematic. Mm. Chapter of fiction, chapter of non-fiction, chapter of fiction, essay. And Woolf, the least schematic of writers, I don't feel could have sustained that very long. And I certainly felt that if Virginia Woolf couldn't do it, I couldn't. And it seemed much more satisfactory to me to have kind of tangle of fiction and non-fiction, whether that was essay or a little bit of memoir, and for the reader to not necessarily always be able to tell where one ended and the other began.
I'm really glad you made that point about how schematic that plan was, because it strikes me hearing you talk, that desire to write a novel that doesn't feel like a novel. Your narrator, in theory and practice, makes that same point, but she says, I wanted a form that allowed for formlessness and mess. And I think, I think part of the real achievement here is to do something that is so kind of intellectually robust and rigorous and curious on the one hand, but also messy and complicated like human beings and tells a kind of novelistic story on the other. And I wonder, did you have to consciously go in and mess it up at intervals? Did you find yourself going, well, no, this is too rigid, or these modes are too self-evident, and I have to just blur the edges a bit more?
No, not really. Not as far as form was concerned. But the mess I was interested in was much more human mess. So that, for the narrator, as well as for many of the other characters, there is this messy gap between theory and practice, between our ideals and our actions. I'm always interested in that when it comes to character. And I would say that art really is energized by that mess because it's complex and contradictory. And those are things that art feeds on. Those are things that the novel feeds on. Or maybe I feed on them as a writer and reader. And so that was the kind of mess I was interested in. And as for the formlessness, well, just because sometimes you can't tell what is fictive and what isn't.
When we return, Michelle discusses sexual jealousy, feminism, and what it means to be a writer in the public eye. We'll be right back. The gulf between theory and practice, between who we want to be and who we are, it might be best served by the novel artistically. Is that best embodied by our 20s in terms of in a life? Is that what that period of being at university in your 20s is for?
Not really. I think, I'm sure there's still quite a lot of mess between my theories and my practice.
No, you're reconciled as a human being at this point.
But I do think that, in one's early 20s, one is asking the question, how should a person be? So it's an attractive period for a novelist because you're still trying to figure out what life is for and what it will hold for you and how you can get there and what you should do. So I think there is a lot of energy and a lot of mess when you are in your early 20s, as the narrator is. I think that, Woolf, for instance, there's someone who went on being contradictory and messy right to the end of her life. And we all do that, I think.
Do you think culturally we're at a low point for capacity to process those contradictions in the people and in particular in the artists who we admire?
Yeah, that's such a good question, isn't it? It is a very topical one, what we do with the failings and flaws of writers we admire. The emblematic writer for me, when that comes up, isn't Woolf, it's V.S. Naipaul. The man was a monster. What can you say? Racist, misogynistic, Islamophobic, Brahminist, you name it, he's been there, he's done that, he's got it on a T-shirt. And yet, an extraordinary, brilliant writer, really brilliant and really, really important for hundreds of thousands of diasporic writers. So, there's the man and there's the work. I really understand someone who's young and hasn't read Naipaul and says, I don't want to read those people. I really understand that. I really get that. Or an older person who says, I don't want to read those people. Totally. But for me, I did read them and they are part of who I am. So, remember Macaulay, he says, judgment is simply trying to reject a part of what we are because it hurts. The living cannot call the dead collect. They won't accept the charge, and it reverts.
Oh, that's fantastic.
I don't expect artists of any kind to be saints, to be without failings and flaws and shortcomings. But I think it is part of our moment that artists are so much in the public gaze now because of social media, for instance. And so there is increasingly this request, one might almost say a demand, that the artist's private life must conform to an ideal in the work, that if the artist is a prominent person, that then their private life must be equally flawless. I mean, what am I trying to say? I think if they're getting accolades for their work, then their selves should also deserve accolades.
It's also the point that you make so well in Theory and Practice about truth, about the artist who professes to tell or share a truth or illuminate a truth that otherwise goes, unremarked upon. Is that then that holds them to some kind of moral standard if they're an arbiter of truth?
Oh, absolutely. And so, I mean, for Woolf, obviously, she wrote quite brilliantly about women's lives and took the patriarchy to task on that score. And therefore, there's the expectation that she has to also be virtuous when it comes to matters of race, for instance, or anything else. And really, she wasn't, I mean, she was horrible about pretty much everyone in her diaries, which are great, wonderful literary documents. And she was gossipy. She was often catty, and she was human.
I do like the way in which, in Theory and Practice, you do put forward a case that it's perhaps in sexual jealousy that we best see the illustration of our idea of ourselves and how we live our lives being diverging. It's a particularly acute example, particularly for a young feminist, to identify sexual jealousy in oneself.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think in the world there are many ways in which the gap becomes evident, politically, for instance. But, I was writing about a young woman. In any young person's life, sex, desire, romantic entanglements loom particularly large at this point in one's life. And so that was the narrative I chose to tell. There is the wish on the narrator's behalf to be a good feminist and her inability to follow through when it comes to the woman she constructs as her rival, who is her lover's official partner. And I thought it was good to write about jealousy because it is such a source of shame. And shame is an interesting emotion because it has tremendous silencing power. And what is being silenced, what cannot be expressed, is always of interest to a novelist, isn't it?
Yeah.
You want to express it.
Just at a technical level, at a level of form and process, the sense of play and the sense of fun in this book runs all the way through it. And I'm curious about whether that was the experience of writing it as well.
That's a good question. It only took me a year to write, which is probably on average half the time it takes me to write a book, but it's half as long. There were many times of just work and, the kind of doubt that besets any writer, thinking, I don't know where this is going, who will want to read this rubbish, etc., etc. I mean, all the things that, wake you up at 3 a.m. But I would say that when I had finished the first draft, actually, even when I'd finished the book, I mean, there's always just a sense of, a little adrenaline rush because you've just actually made something. So there was that. But beyond that, I think I really felt a sense of exhilaration. I felt I had made something different. And that was very pleasing to me. And I would say that, again, without in any way trying to diminish the amount of work and revision that any novel requires, I felt with this book, as with no other, that It was somehow already inside me, and I just needed to be able to get it out there, to give it a form for it to exist in the world.
Michelle de Kretser's latest novel, Theory and Practice, is out now. Before we go, I wanted to tell you what I've been reading this week. And almost a year ago to the day, we had on as a guest Geraldine Brooks. She gave her life sentence and she spoke movingly about her writing career, about Horse, her most recent novel, but she also talked about her late husband. And she's just brought out a beautiful memoir called Memorial Day that deals with the grief and shock that came upon his unexpected death a few years ago. It's an absolutely beautiful memoir, as you would expect, and I can't recommend it highly enough. You can also go back to the archive and listen to that conversation with the peerless Geraldine Brooks. That book again is called Memorial Day. You can find it and all of Geraldine Brooks's books, and Michelle de Kretser's books, and Virginia Woolf's books. In fact, lots of books can be found at your local independent bookstore or library. That's it for this week's show. If you enjoyed it, please tell your friends and rate and review us. It helps a lot. On next week's show, I'll be in conversation with the brilliant Rachel Kong, discussing her latest novel, Real Americans, and what luck means to her as a writer.
Luck is, I think, really at the core of this book, this question of what creates our lives, essentially. Is it luck? Is it chance? Is it the actions that we take? Is it free will, right? And that's just a question that I've thought about for all my life, I think.
Read This is a Schwartz Media production made possible by the generous support of ARA Group. The show is produced and edited by Clara Ames, with mixing by Travis Evans and original compositions by Zoltan Fetcher. Thanks for listening. See you next week.